Well, welcome back. And wasn't that a great panel we just had over lunch, too? What an exciting time we're in and amazing opportunities in front of us. We've got a number of opportunities both here in the U.S. and obviously on the other side of the Atlantic with the United States' most treasured ally, the United Kingdom. And with us today to talk specifically about that is a man you have seen on television. You've seen probably here at President's Club in the past before, Dan Hannan. But to introduce him, I want to introduce a colleague of mine from Heritage Foundation. And it's important to note that we're in the 10 years after celebrating the 10-year anniversary this year of Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. And for those of you who are new to Heritage, and many of you are, 10 years ago, Margaret Thatcher herself and the Thatcher Foundation decided that there was one place in the world that would bear her name in a policy center, and that was at the Heritage Foundation. And because of the special work that Heritage and Ed Fulner and our board had done with President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher over the many years, she dedicated, and her foundation made a very generous commitment to Heritage to make this happen and inspire other supporters to do that as well. For the last 10 years, the leader of the Thatcher Center at Heritage is our colleague Nile Gardiner. Nile is a longtime not only supporter of freedom, a great friend of liberty, and a scholar who had worked directly with Lady Thatcher on several of her books and was her direct research associate. Nile, as you may know and have seen, is all over the airwaves. Back in the days 12 years ago, Nile helped to break the Iraq oil for food scandal, and at that point was the only person ever to appear on the Bill O'Reilly show twice in 1 week. And we look forward to welcoming you, Nile. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Nile Gardiner.
Thank you very much for those very kind words, John. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here at the Heritage Foundation's President's Club meeting. My former boss, Margaret Thatcher, would have loved today's gathering of true conservatives, the standard bearers of liberty and freedom in this great nation of America. It is my great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Daniel Hannan. I've known Dan since we were students together studying modern history at Oriel College, Oxford University. And although we were in different years, I hate to say it, Dan's actually 1 year younger than me, we shared many of the same tutors who were a powerful influence on our thinking and later our careers. Even in his college days, Dan was a born leader, already dedicated to the cause of British sovereignty and combating the evils of the European Union. He was marked for greatness then, and later became a Conservative member of the European Parliament, standing up for British interests in the belly of the beast, Brussels. If you think big government is bad in America, take a trip to Belgium. I've known Daniel Hannan to always be a man of tremendous principle and conviction, someone whose formative years were during the Thatcher Revolution of the 1980s. And like the Iron Lady, Dan is a true patriot, driven above all by love for his country. It was this deep-seated dedication that drove Dan to play a lead role in the campaign for Britain to leave the European Union. Indeed, Dan was one of the very first British voices to call for a referendum on EU membership, despite putting his own job at risk. The Brexit vote on June 23rd this year struck a great blow for sovereignty and for freedom. It was a huge victory for the principle of self-determination and an emphatic rejection of the idea that the British people should be subject to the rule of unelected bureaucrats sitting in Brussels with imperial impunity. When the British people are finally free of the shackles of the EU by 2019, according to the timetable set out by Prime Minister Theresa May, they will have Dan and his fellow Conservative rebels to thank for their freedom. Please join me in welcoming to the President's Club my good friend and fellow freedom fighter, Daniel Hannan. Thank you.
Well, Nile, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, how wonderful to see you. It's such a pleasure to be here as an elected politician speaking to a crowd where no one can vote for me and no one can vote against me. I can say whatever I like. It's very liberating. I'll tell you, there is nothing like an election to remind the elected representative of the full range of wildlife whom he represents. I can see Senator Dement smiling. This is a kind of, he knows what I'm talking about, but he can't admit it. It's a home game for him. It's an away game for me. But I tell you, at the last election, I canvassed one farmer on the Isle of Wight who told me this very involved story. He was very excited when he found that I was his member of the European Parliament. He told me about a seed bull that had been very expensive, that apparently just wouldn't do the business. He put it with all his heifers, it wouldn't serve any of them. And then online he'd discovered a drug. And he mixed it in with a feed, and bingo, the bull couldn't get enough of it. All the cows were in calf. He was delighted about this. And he'd learned that the European Union was going to ban the substance. And I said, well, sir, I'll look into that for you. What's the name? He said, well, I can't rightly remember the correct chemical name, but I can tell you that it tastes of aniseed. I knocked on one door in a town called Woking, and it was answered by a little boy who must have been all of about 10 years old, and he was wearing around his shoulders a great smoking jacket, hanging loosely to the floor. In one hand, he was swirling a balloon of brandy about the size of his little head. And in the other hand, smouldering slowly ceilingwards, was what smelled like a very expensive Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down, I said, are your mum and dad at home? And he said, does it effing look as though my mum and dad are at home? But what a pleasure to be in this town. What a pleasure to be among you great Conservatives, and you celebrating, because I can see both of the current and the former presidents of Heritage in the audience, two real patriots who showed by example what it's possible to achieve by sticking to your principles, not by accepting the world as it is, but by making a dent in it, by bending it to the way it ought to be. And all of you who support them, all of you who support Heritage, thank you from the other side of the Atlantic. You're not just American patriots, you are also champions of the freedom movement globally. Please don't think it goes unnoticed or unappreciated. Let me start with a story that I came across last year about a chap here, an American chap, who spent a long time making himself a chicken sandwich. Nothing very unusual there, you might think. Except that this fellow decided to do the whole thing from scratch. He ground the bread, ground the corn to make the bread. He milked a cow. He curdled the milk and turned it into cheese. He pickled a cucumber. He slaughtered a chicken. He went to the seaside to collect seawater to boil it off to make the salt. And the whole process took him 6 months and cost him several $1,000s. And by the way, I think even that was kind of a cheat, because he flew to the seaside, right? So he was using modern advanced technology. He didn't grow the cow himself. He didn't grow the chicken himself. 6 months. There is a reminder of how the world would be if we didn't rely on specialization and exchange. There's a little throwback to how life was for our remote ancestors before they began to discover trade. A chicken sandwich, for heaven's sake, right? We're not talking about a smartphone or a car. Just imagine if we had to live life dependent on our own endeavors for every advance, that we didn't have these networks of trade and specialization. It's the most human thing to be blasé about what's familiar, to take for granted the advantages of a modern market economy. The great theologian G.K. Chesterton said, "We are perishing for want of wonder, not for want of wonders." But think of the wonder involved in a chicken sandwich next time you buy one. Think of everything that has gone in to that chicken sandwich. Not just the mayonnaise and the lettuce and so on, but the lumberjack who felled the tree that made the cardboard wrapper, and the guy who drove it to the shop that you could buy it just on your doorstep, and the lady who kept the accounts for the haulage company, and all the rest of it. And then ponder the almost miraculous fact that that chicken sandwich can be purchased by someone on the minimum wage for the equivalent of 19 minutes' work. In that shrinkage, 6 months to 19 minutes, lies the whole of civilization. In that saving of time are to be found symphonies and Snapchat and Starbucks and Starships. All of it comes out of specialization and exchange. Now, why have I come to DC to tell you about a chicken sandwich? Well, because, frankly, watching the recent presidential campaign, it occurred to me that we are losing the argument for free trade and free markets. Politicians respond to public opinion. Trust me on this. And politicians have responded to public opinion on this issue. The paradox of our age is that the human race has never been in a better condition than now. You can look at any metric, longevity, literacy, calorie intake, height. There's never been a better time to be alive. And yet, the thing that made us so well off, the thing that lifted us to this pinnacle, has never been so out of fashion. Idealistic young people, well-meaning, altruistic young people, are occupying Wall Street, protesting G7 meetings, marching against trade deals, thinking that in doing so they are standing up for the poorest people on the planet against the big multinational corporations. When in reality they're doing exactly the opposite. Nobody stands to gain more from distortions and restrictions of trade than the big multinationals. And no one stands to gain more from their lifting than the poorest people on Earth. In 1990, 38% of human beings lived in extreme poverty, defined by the United Nations as an income of $1 a day or less. Today, that figure is 8%. We can realistically look forward to the total eradication of poverty. And where have the declines been sharpest? In those Asian and African economies that have joined the global market system. If I think of the changes in my lifetime that have been wrought by free trade, specialization, comparative advantage. I was born in 1971. In 1971, it took the average American worker more than a month to be able to afford a color TV set. Now it's less than 2 days. In 1971, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car today moving at full speed. In 1971, fewer than half of girls globally completed primary education. Today, it's more than 90%. That's the miracle. And yet, people are protesting against it as never before, and politicians are responding. With the result that the total volume of trade is in relative decline for the first time in peacetime since the Great Depression. Now, I can tell you exactly why that is. The problem is one of, if I can sum it up in 4 words, dispersed gains, concentrated losses. Let's say that tomorrow the United States decided to admit all Chinese steel, even if it was dumped, even if it were produced at below market price. Almost everyone would be a bit better off. Car manufacturers would increase their productivity without having to do anything. They'd be able to take more people on. Prices would fall for everybody. And not a single voter would respond. Again, take my word for this as someone who's been in this game. Not one American would say, oh, I'm $68 a year better off because of the lower prices. I'm going to vote for the guy who delivered that deal. But of course, the losers, the newly unemployed steel workers in Pennsylvania or whatever, they will know exactly whom to blame, and they will vote accordingly. Let me give you a hard, concrete example rather than just a theoretical one. In September 2009, in response to pressure from the Steelworkers Union, Barack Obama did agree to impose tariffs on the import of wheels for trucks and other vehicles from China. Tariffs went up to 35%. The cost to the US economy was $1.1 billion because, of course, people had to spend more money on buying more expensive produce than before. Did it save jobs? Well, yes, it did. It saved 1,200 jobs. 1,200 jobs that had an average salary of $40,000 each. So for an outlay of over $1 billion, the government saved jobs worth $48 million. But it was worse than that. Because in pushing up prices, they were taking money out of the economy. People were not able to spend on other things what they were now having to spend on the artificially expensive wheels. 3,700 jobs were lost. Some of those jobs would have been jobs occupied by members of the Steelworkers Union. The trouble is, the gains are dispersed and invisible. The costs are concentrated and palpable. It's what the French economist Frédéric Bastiat would have called the difference between the seen and the unseen. It's something you come across again and again in politics. The beneficiaries of your policy attribute their good fortune to themselves. The losers attribute their ill fortune to you. So how are we going to win this argument? How is it that we can restore honor and purpose to the idea of compassion, of free exchange and voluntary specialization? Well, I think we need to approach this question in a way that those altruistic Occupy people will respond to. It's not enough to sell free trade as a source of cheaper shirts or cheaper iPhones. We need to defend it as the ultimate instrument of poverty alleviation, of conflict resolution, and of social justice. And we have the most extraordinary story to tell. About 10,000 years ago, our remote ancestors discovered that if you put seeds in the ground, they grow into crops. The agrarian revolution, transformative. But it took about 5 minutes before they made the next discovery, which is that you optimize the ratio of effort to outcome if instead of spending all year cultivating your own crops, you plunder other people's. And then about 5 minutes after that, they made the corollary discovery, which is that the best ratio of all of effort to outcome is to regularize that plunder through a system of tithes, tolls, and taxes. And thus, the first states were born in tyranny. And so it carried on for nearly 10,000 years. The normal condition of the human race was oppression, poverty, slavery, serfdom, caste. Until the miracle of capitalism. For 10,000 years, history was the story not of the 1%, but of the 1% of the 1%. The rest of us were bending our backs dawn to dusk every day in the field in conditions of bondage and servitude. And then this miraculous discovery that instead of having a controlled system where the law was the will of the biggest guy in the tribe, you could have voluntary exchange among autonomous individuals, able to make contracts one with another rather than mediating all their relationships through birth, tradition, and caste. That revolution is what's raised our species to its current level of wealth. And it's made us not just freer, but more cooperative. Right? How many times have you heard well-meaning left-wing friends saying the trouble with free markets is they make us selfish, right? There's got to be more to life than that. What about cooperation? Do you know? I'm guessing you all have left-wing friends because here we are in Washington, D.C., right? The real miracle of the capitalist system is that it forces us into empathy. All of those people in that network that I was telling you about the chicken sandwich, all of them had to see it from the other people's point of view. What lifted humanity from a warrior society into a modern merchant one was that sense of empathy that markets necessarily force on their practitioners. So not only does it make us freer, not only does it make us more cooperative, it makes us happier. And again, your left-wing friends will say to you, well, okay, even if we concede, you heritage supporters, even if we're prepared to allow that the market system is efficient, even if it's true that it works better than socialism as a way of allocating resources, surely they'll say there's got to be more to life than this, right? There's got to be more valuable things. Listening to Beethoven, or going for a nice walk in the country, or playing with your kids, that's got to be worth more than money. Well, yeah, of course, right? I mean, here we all are. We're all conservatives, right? Hands up if you know anyone who gets more pleasure from a large bank balance than from playing with their kids, or listening to Beethoven, or going for a walk in a country, right? The argument is about how you maximize human happiness, whether state control or whether freedom is the best way of doing that. And economic growth is the thing that drives our contentment. Right? It's because of the modern market economy that we have time to do all of these things. It's because you can afford a dishwasher, whereas our parents had to do everything by hand, that we have time to go for that nice walk in the country. It's because we have a car to drive to work and back, instead of having to take 3 or 4 buses and trams, that we have time to listen to the Beethoven. It's because we don't have to work 7 days a week just to feed our kids, that we're able to play with them at weekends. Don't let anybody tell you that markets are just soulless, efficient allocators of resources. They are the best way of making human beings interact one with another in their fullest potential. How do you really win this argument? You do it. It's always difficult, as we've seen in this election, to win in academic terms the argument for free trade. But once you've opened your markets, nobody ever goes back. Think of the countries that have done this. Hong Kong, New Zealand, Singapore. Nobody in those countries now says, let's go back to having subsidies and tariffs and quotas and regulation. And it's here that we now have an opportunity with Britain leaving the European Union. Brexit can be made to work for everybody's benefit. It's going to work to our benefit. We're going to get our democracy back. We're going to get our freedom back. That's great and all the rest of it. But let's try and be a little bit more global in our thinking. Britain can be the first big economy, the first G7 nation, to open its markets across the board, something that only the little tiddlers like Singapore have so far done. Now, when Singapore did that, it was very good news for them. Singapore was a tropical swamp in the 1950s. It's now one of the wealthiest places on earth. Per capita income in Singapore is twice what it is in the United Kingdom now. That's what happens if you're prepared to invite the traffic and commerce of the world to your territory. But with the best will in the world, the wealth of Singapore has had only a negligible impact on everybody else. The 5th biggest economy on the planet doing the same thing, that has the potential to lift everybody. We can do more for producers in developing countries than we ever did with decades of government-to-government aid, simply by allowing them to sell their produce. Not only will we encourage good governance in those countries, but we'll be able to raise their living standard at 0 cost to our taxpayers. Indeed, on the contrary, at a huge gain to our consumers. And the biggest gains will be felt by the poorest people, for whom buying textiles and food, the basic commodities, represents the highest percentage of their income. So this is the ethical case for free markets. And right at the front of our list of priorities has got to be looking at a deal with the world's biggest economy. And here, there has been a very welcome change in rhetoric since the election. I don't know if you were aware that Barack Obama came over during our referendum campaign and told us in no uncertain terms that we were to vote to stay. He doesn't like being defied. He's very clear when he gives instructions. He said, if you vote to leave the European Union, you will be at the back of the line for any trade deal. Except he considerately used the British vernacular and said at the back of the queue if there'll be any trade deals to be done. Well, of course, it did have some impact. There were 4 opinion polls the next week, and they all showed a big swing to the vote leave position. Not often that I get the chance to have Barack Obama being applauded by a heritage audience, so let's just savor that while it happened. And I'll tell you why it happened. I'll tell you why there was that reaction. I'll be honest, it wasn't because there was any great personal dislike of Obama. There isn't. It's because we knew that he was urging on us a policy that no American would countenance. You want to understand why Britain voted leave? Look at your Declaration of Independence, published here by the Heritage Foundation. Right? I've spent 8 years urging people in the Obama administration to read your Constitution. I've given up on that. So let's set the bar a little bit lower and start with the Declaration of Independence and look at how aptly these phrases apply to Britain and the European Union. Here are the grievances. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for abolishing the free system of English laws. We knew that this, of all countries, would never accept a federal union at supranational level. Just imagine if I were to come here and to say, guys, here's the plan. We would like you to join a Pan-American federation. It'll have a Pan-American parliament in, I don't know, Havana, which will have the power to legislate directly for you with immediate effect within the US. Right? There will be a Pan-American Supreme Court in, I don't know, Managua, which will have the power to strike down acts of Congress. And why don't we, while we're about it, why don't we throw in a Pan-American central bank in Buenos Aires, which will administer your new currency, the Pan-American peso? I'm guessing that your reaction, if I were to suggest those things, would be buzz off. One or two of you, including possibly the president-elect, might use a stronger word than buzz. And you'd be right. A country that has reclaimed its independence rarely looks back. And that was why President Obama, why his intervention backfired. It was because we knew that he was urging something that his countrymen would never countenance for a moment. But what a refreshing change. I tell you, I have, to the day I die, was there anyone here from Indiana? Anyone from Indiana? One, very good. Or two, fantastic. That's probably about in proportion with the national population, isn't it, in this room? I will, to the day I die, have a special place in my heart for Hoosiers in general, and for Governor Pence in particular, because just after Obama made that back of the queue comment, the state of Indiana took out a series of full-page advertisements in British newspapers saying, cousins, you're always at the front of our queue in Indiana, right? And I tell you, the word queue is now going to become generalized here, isn't it? I mean, it's going to be, we'll work on lift next. And so when I hear this president and this administration talking about Britain being at the front of the queue, I see a huge opportunity, a tie-up between the largest and the fifth largest economies in the world, potentially a huge boost to the GDP of both countries with no downside, right? Even if you are of a protectionist bent, I don't think there's any scenario where you can seriously fret that steel workers are going to lose their jobs in Dearborn, Michigan, because they're going to be outsourcing to Corby in Northamptonshire, right? It's not going to happen. Now, here's the challenge. We've got to get this right. Now, if I sat down with Heritage, we could do this in 5 minutes. It would be a straightforward, mutual product recognition, open trade deal. We would avoid the corporate capture and all the regulation that was in TTIP and the TPP, the two great Obama deals. We would just say, listen, if you can do it in your country, you can do it in ours. If you're licensed to practice on the New York Stock Exchange, you can practice in the London one. If you can sell insurance in Britain, you can sell it here. If a drug is okayed by your FDA, it's on sale in the UK, etc. Of course, if we left this to the officials on both sides, I think we can safely say that that's not what would happen. It would end up being about climate change and protection of rare species and everything except actual trade. But if we get this right, it's a template for the entire world. We can show that there is a different way of doing trade that lifts the individual and extends consumer choice instead of being captured by the big corporates who use the regulatory system to raise barriers to entry and entrench their monopoly. And if we can't do a successful trade deal between Britain and the US, which two other countries in the world can? Is there a more natural common market than one linked by language and law, by custom and kinship, by habit and history? And indeed by all the practical business considerations like having the same accountancy system, the same arbitration model, the same unwritten business etiquette. 1 million Americans turn up to work every day for British companies. 1 million Brits clock in every day to work for American companies. You are the single biggest investor in the UK. We are the single biggest investor here. The only thing that hasn't followed is trade, because trade is controlled by Brussels rather than by London. And that's the opportunity that we now have. And if we can get a free trade deal that works, not only is it an inspiration to the rest of the world, but it underpins also that wider security system expressed in the alliance of free English-speaking peoples, the Anglosphere, on whose strength the security and prosperity of mankind depend a great deal more than people like to admit. There have been 3 great ideological conflicts in the last 100 years, 3 global contests in which a system that elevates the individual over the collective has been pitted against systems that do the opposite. The number of countries that were on the right side in all 3, the First World War and the Second World War and the Cold War, well, it's a short list, but it does include all the free English-speaking nations. Now, coming together again, we have the opportunity to spread prosperity, the rule of law, by our example, by showing others what free people can do when you move the rocks and you let the grass grow. Britain and America together have made this planet happier and freer and safer. And we still have more to give. Our song is not yet sung. So be true to the vision of your founders. Stand by the heritage that this foundation was established to defend. Pass on intact to your kids the freedoms that you were lucky enough to inherit from your parents. And never be shy about speaking to and for the soul of this great nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you're privileged to be part.